Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Delighted to see you all for another Baker briefing. We have an exceptional guest speaker for you. Actually, we have two this evening, one from the Institute and one a distinguished visitor. From the Institute, we have Tony Payan, the director of our U.S. Mexico Center. Tony and I are about to head to Mexico City, so it will be an interesting exchange for all of you to hear the issues we're going to be talking about when we head down there. But the guest with whom Tony will be engaging this evening is an old colleague and friend from the Department of State from many, many years, Ambassador Tony Wayne. Ambassador Wayne has had an exceptional career. Perhaps the most interesting part of it is after his government service, like me, Tony did not really retire, but went into a variety of educational, policy, think tank work in academia and related to academia in Washington, D.C., dealing both with Mexico but also with diplomacy and the practice of diplomacy as well, which is, I think, the best way possible to have a second part of a career after the formal government service has ended. But when he was with the government, Tony was U.S. Ambassador to Mexico from 2011 to 2015. He was the coordinating director for development and economic affairs and deputy U.S. Ambassador to Afghanistan. Now, that sounds like a complex title, and the mission certainly was complex. Like Iraq, Afghanistan presented so many mission management, policy management challenges that there were multiple ambassador rank officials there, 5, all of whom were extraordinary individuals. A very interesting effort to apply basic economic, commercial principles to a near state of nature. And as I say often should be the motto of the Foreign Service, we tried. Tony was ambassador to Argentina from 2006 to 2009. From 96 to 2000, he was the deputy chief of mission at the U.S. mission to the European Union, perhaps the critical mission in Europe in terms of overall management of the U.S. relationship with the EU, economic, commercial, political, and security. But most interestingly in his career, Tony was the Assistant Secretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs. That's the overall coordinating function, works with all the bureaus in the department, works in coordinating economic and business policy for posts overseas. It's the place to go to if you're in Washington in a geographic bureau, if you're overseas in an embassy, to seek guidance on policy issue. There's an Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs, but the real substantive work, I think it is fair to say, Tony, lies with the Assistant Secretary. And in my 40-plus years in the department, no one did that job better than Tony Wayne, in every sense of the word. So you come with a wide background, lots of experience, lots of work, as we do here, in how you continue to advocate for reasonable policies, how you train another generation on these issues, all of which is important. But tonight we're going to talk about Mexico, the U.S. Mexico relationship. We are one of only 3 institutes in the United States that deal with U.S. Mexican relations. UC San Diego, the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., and us. So it is delightful to have you here, Tony. Welcome always, and please, the podium is yours.
Well, thank you, David. You all are very fortunate to have such an accomplished civil servant, foreign service officer, ambassador, and much more now leading you, and having Tony Payan as the head of your Mexico enterprise here, which is such a tremendously important relationship that we have. And I'm very happy to be with you to talk about this relationship today. So let me start off with one key phrase, intermestic. Remember that about the U.S. Mexico relationship. It is international and domestic at the same time. It touches more lives of Americans than any other relationship in the world. Say hi to your friend, that's okay. It's all, that happens to me all the time. And my wife usually reaches over and put that on mute. So you can see from this slide, and I'm going to use a lot of slides. I like slides because I think it says it conveys more. You can watch that and listen to me at the same time. But this relationship, think of all the other relationships. We got a lot of Irish Americans, we have people whose heritage is elsewhere, but this relationship with Mexico actually touches people's lives in so many different ways. And some of them are good, some of them are bad. The good parts are the trading relationship, the cultural connections we have, the heritage that Mexican Americans bring and contribute to our society. And on the negative side, we have the public security issues, we have managing the migration challenges at the border. We have a whole bunch of different issues. So that means that anything that happens can set off in both countries very political and very emotional debates. So let's go through some of these, and then we can talk about some of them at the end. This is just to show you the kind of challenges that we face. So this relationship. We have over 30 different U.S. agencies at our embassy in Mexico. We have 2,700 people that work at our embassy and our consulates around Mexico. The Mexicans have not only their embassy, but over 50 consulates in the United States. And all of these entities are dealing with a vast array of different issues that come up, often surprising you as ambassador or as another officer at the embassy, often discovering new issues you didn't know existed that you have to deal with in this relationship. So let's start off with trade. Mexico is our second largest export market, our second largest supplier of imports, the largest agricultural market we have, second largest, and very important, as you can see here, for a number of states around the United States. And we're going to see this. That one of the interesting things to note is that trade with Mexico has just been jumping ahead and growing immensely over the past several years. And you can see that on this slide. 18% growth between 2021 and 2022. That's really a pretty amazing amount of growth in trade between countries that already had a big trade. Now Mexico's feeling pretty good about that, since they had their largest surplus with the United States historically ever because of that. Why is that? We're going to look at that. It's because we build things together. Most of the manufacturer groups goods coming back into the United States, and we'll look at this, have Mexican components, U.S. components in them, pardon me. We actually make more together with Mexico than we make with any other country in the world. And as you can see here, this trade is vital for Mexico. It accounts for about 39% of their GDP. You're going to see that their growth, their GDP growth in the last several years was due to the trade with the United States and remittances from the United States. This was the total. If you take goods and services and put them together, because the big number you see here is just in goods, it adds up to $1.5 million a minute. That's the key thing to remember. $1.5 million a minute. So if I've been talking for, 5 minutes here, that's $7.5 million has already crossed that border. It's a lot of trade that's going on. And there are a lot of people that cross the border. 1 million border crossings a day on average. And that's people going in each direction. It dropped off during the pandemic. It's now back up to the pre-pandemic levels. So we've almost doubled our trade with Mexico since 2010. You can see how steep this curve is. You can see the little drop there in 2019. But we've really just been building a relationship 6 times larger than it was in 1995 that is not appreciated by most Americans and probably by most Mexicans either, how much we are doing together. You can see here, this is the 2022 trading relationship. Canada, a little bit ahead of Mexico. So that means also you can say you can apply these numbers to Canada too. We're trading about $1.5 million a minute with Canada. But you can see, other than China, there's a gigantic drop-off in our trading partners. And I think, as many of you know, since you're from Texas, that Mexico's trade with Texas is about the same, and a little bit larger than our trade with Germany, which is down there on this list. Now, this is why, look at this slide, because this is really what tells you what's so special about this trading relationship. It shows how much of a good coming back to the United States, a manufactured good, how much of the value of that is from U.S. products. And this is for manufactured goods, largely vehicles. So about 40% of let's take a Japanese, a Honda, put together in Jalisco, Mexico, coming back to the United States, let's say it's valued at $30,000. Well, 40% of that is stuff that was brought from the United States and put together in Mexico. So that's a relationship unlike we have with anybody else. As you can see, the next closest country is Canada, and then it drops way off. This is because we've been building things together since the early 1990s, and the private sector has built these vast networks of co-production. It's not governments that did this. This is the private sector that's done this. So this accounts for about 5 million U.S. jobs being supported by this trade. And just, I have the reminder here that when everybody was arguing for NAFTA in the early 1990s, their big argument was, well, we have 700,000 jobs dependent on trade with Mexico. Certainly we have to approve this agreement. Well, that 700,000 is now grown to at least, 4,900,000. So that's 7 times as much. A lot of growth. Now this is what's interesting. If you look at this map, it shows you what are the largest trading states that trade with Mexico. And so it's not just Texas and California and Arizona, right? It's these industrial states in the middle of the country. Why is that? What do they make there? Cars. Oh, right, you got it. It's because 20% of North American trade is vehicle trade. Parts made in all 3 countries being shipped across the borders, being put together in all 3 countries. And who benefits from that? All of you. You get to pay $1,000, $1,500, $2,000 less because we make those parts, put them together in the place that makes the most sense for the price that the vehicles can be sold. Now, and that isn't just U.S. brand cars, as I indicated with my Honda mention. It's any car that you might buy that's produced in North America. So just another reminder here, since we're in a border state, look how big the border states would be if they were one country. They would be the 3rd or 4th largest GDP in the world. And the 3rd or 4th depends on whether you count the EU as one economy or not. Be number 3 if you just went by nation states, but it'd be number 4 if you counted the EU in there. So this is a really potent economic zone along our shared border. This is the other big plus that Mexicans get from the United States. These are remittances. That's the money that Mexicans in the United States send back to their families in Mexico. And surprisingly, it actually jumped, as you can see here, in 2021 and 2022 significantly. people sending a lot more money back home. This was a big boost to Mexico, and it really helped them come out of the recession that they suffered during the pandemic. So let's look at the border. So this picture of the border, many of you know this very well, but the red dots show all the formal crossing points. The formal crossing points are where experts believe most of the bad things as well as the good things cross. Most of the drugs are believed to pass through these formal points, not across the spaces in between. And of course, all the legal trade in both directions goes across these points, and the million people that cross over doing their normal daily business, most of them going back and forth. So one of the big positive things is is visitors that go back, tourism between the two countries. And I put this in here just to remind people that it's not just goods, it's services also that make a big difference. So you can see this is about a $40 billion market, tourism in both directions. And it's not just U.S. tourists going to Mexico, it's Mexican tourists coming to the United States. Now, I think we're back up almost, if not at, almost at the pre-pandemic levels in tourism between the two countries. And it will probably continue expanding as we go forward. This is just to show you a lot of that crossing the border. You can see that the number of trucks crossing the border pretty well parallels the trade between the two countries. Most of the trade is via truck. There's some via railroad, but most of it is trucks. Now, this is just the other thing at the border, and this is just to show you historically. This is from 1960 up through 2022. These are the number of migrants that have been encountered or apprehended at the border. So you could see that we've had high points in the past that in the 1990s, a little bit in the 80s, but in the mid-1990s, there were a lot of people coming across our southern border. And it wasn't quite the crisis that it's been perceived as in the last few years. We can maybe talk about why that is. But this, I put it up here just to show that this is not a new phenomena that we've been experiencing recently. Many of you already know that. And in fact, between in the last few years, let's just say, until 2017, more Mexicans were returning to Mexico than were coming to the United States. The cap of the high point for Mexicans in the United States was 2007. After that, more started returning to Mexico than were coming in. Why was that? The economy was growing in Mexico. People actually wanted to go home. They didn't want to stay here. They would rather be home in their pueblos. They just couldn't do that under the immigration system that existed on a regular basis. I came away from my years in Mexico strongly believing that if we had a bigger and very effective temporary work program, we could get good workers, and many Mexicans would rather just come and work for 6 months and go back home and have value added there, but really wanted to be living in Mexico. But because of the way our immigration policy and other things went, they really couldn't do that, but their family needed the money. So we can talk about the pros and cons of that later on. But I think this is very interesting, that by 2017, there were more non-Mexicans in an authorized status and irregular status in the United States than there were Mexicans. Now that's changed a little bit in the past couple of years. The number of Mexicans crossing the border have gone up, and the number of Central Americans went up first, and now in the last couple of years, the number of others from Latin America have soared. There are a lot of reasons for this that we can talk about, but this has created a new mix, in a sense, at the border that we haven't experienced before. As you know, a lot of people were able to be returned very rapidly under the COVID-related Title 42 part of the law. That was an easy way for governments, both during the Trump and the Biden administration, to deal with this, but it really didn't do anything to deal with the problem because a lot of them would just come back again soon afterwards. So you really we've needed for a long time a better overall long-term approach to this that we can talk about. You can see on this chart the purple line are Mexicans. The light blue line are other than Mexicans or Central America or Northern Tier Central Americans, and the sort of dark blue, red, and green lines are El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. Now, what you can see is this mix has changed. In 2019, there were many more of the Northern Tier Central Americans. There were Mexicans, and what's grown between 2019 and this last fiscal year is the number of Mexicans have gone up and the number of Nicaraguans, Haitians, Cubans, Venezuelans, and others have gone up. And that's been one of the challenges for the Biden administration as to what to do with these people. The challenge is that you can't fly people back to Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba. You could to Haiti, but it's such an uncontrolled situation because they won't accept them back. Their governments won't accept them back. You may remember we accepted a couple hundred political opponents from Nicaragua recently, and as a humanitarian gesture. And after they flew out to the United States, the Nicaraguan government took away their citizenship and said, we never want to see them again. So these are governments we don't get along with, and that means it's a real problem to figure out what do you do with the citizens of these countries when they come. It's a difficult decision. Anyway, this is another way of looking at just cutting it so you understand that gray area are single adults. The blue area are families, and the orangish mustard color are unaccompanied minors. So what you can see is the vast amount of people crossing the border are single adults. And this is just to show you that orange at the very bottom are people that were sent home under the COVID pandemic, Title 42. So you can see a bunch of people coming in 2020 on were sent home under this pandemic thing. And that's what the Biden administration had to adjust to when the pandemic was declared over. They had to figure out what are we going to do with the people who are still going to be coming. So let's look for a few minutes at crime, public security along the border. So there are a couple of big drivers that should push the United States and Mexico to closer public security cooperation. This is the first one. You've read a lot about it. It's the deaths, overdose deaths from drugs in the United States, and particularly synthetic opioids, which have gone up significantly starting in 2017 and going through last year. The most famous of these synthetic opioids is fentanyl. It is very potent. It is easy to transport. It is harder to find because small amounts of it are expensive and can be broken down and sold widely. It's easy to make. It's easy to mix stuff together. You don't have to grow a poppy plant and then convert that from opium into heroin, or you don't have to grow a marijuana plant, or you don't have to get coca leaves, right? You just get the chemicals and put them together. So this has really transformed drug trafficking. It has transformed addiction, and it has particularly lethal effect, especially when it's mixed together by criminal organizations that don't really care too much about how much of the poison they put into little pills. And so you get some pills that just kill people immediately because it's an impure mix that's put in there with too much of that fentanyl, which can be deadly very quickly. So this should be pushing U.S. public policy to get even tougher than they've been before and more effective. And I want to say on the demand side as well as the supply side. So Mexico is the supply side. The United States is the demand side. Between the U.S. and Mexico, we used to have big arguments where in Mexico they point and say, it's all your fault because you're buying all this stuff and these drug groups are making $20 billion a year selling to you. And on the U.S. side, people would point back and say, it's all your fault because you don't control these cartels and they bring stuff here and ship it in, and that's how you get the supply. Well, the reality is that both sides share the responsibility. It's really the problem of both sides here. And if you're going to have a solution, you got to deal with demand and supply. And we've had a very hard time doing that between the two countries. So then this is the other driver. It should be a driver, and this is an indication of it's a feeling of being unsafe in Mexico. And so 62%, this is the latest poll, which was from March of this year, was that 62% of Mexicans don't feel secure in their own cities. And, you know, it's down from what you had 80%, but that's still a lot of people feeling insecure in their own cities. And that suggests that there's not a lot of security, and that's because there is indeed a lot of crime. And so if you look at the public opinion polls, you find that over half people say the most serious problem in Mexico is insecurity. And over half the people think that the current administration in Mexico is not doing a good job on insecurity. So this also should be driving, theoretically, if we were getting this right, it should be driving the Mexican government to want to cooperate more closely, more trustingly, produce better results with the United States, because we could help them tackle these problems. Here, this is the total of homicides. It's a pretty straight line, and this is from 2019 through 2022. 2019 was the record year for homicides in Mexico. And so what you can see from this chart is they've come down a little bit over the past couple of years, and it's apparently they're going down a little bit this year. But this current administration in Mexico has already set the historic record for the number of homicides recorded in a 6-year presidential mandate. And they still have a year and a half to go in their presidential mandate. So this is a really very serious problem for Mexico. Estimates are $19 to $30 billion that the cartels make. 50% of the homicides are in 6 states. So there are a number of states that are relatively secure, but there are a number of states that are very insecure with a lot of killing going on. And that this violence cost Mexico 20.8% of its GDP, according to one of the most serious studies that look at Mexico every year. Just think about that. Think if the United States lost 20.8% of its GDP because of criminal violence. It's a horrible plague for them. So a government in Mexico should want to be really serious about this. There are a lot of reasons that some are more or less serious, and we can talk about that as we go forward. So what we tried to do between the U.S. and Mexico is to bolster our cooperation on public security, on fighting crime, but also at looking at what are the problems that are leading to this crime in Mexico, and how can Mexico get better at doing that. So we set up something called the Merida Initiative. It was established in 2007 under George Bush with a Mexican president. We worked on it for over 10 years, as you can see. The goals were not just to go after organized crime, but also to work on rule of law, work on capacity building, work on creating a modern border with high-tech processes, and also to work helping Mexican communities where there were drug cartels and gangs and others dominating that. This program had some successes, but it fell into a period where first, the last administration in Mexico was not very serious about implementing it, and the current administration in Mexico, the president, didn't have confidence in the program, and so did not seriously implement it. We worked out during this period a number of different mechanisms so we could coordinate more closely with the Mexicans, and the idea was to not only help them build capacity, but to build trust and confidence between the security forces on both sides. And at some points in this long history, there was relatively good cooperation. At the moment, there is a very limited amount of trust between the law enforcement and justice officials on both sides of the border. We can talk about that. This particularly deteriorated. You don't have to read or go through all of this. We could talk about it, but it deteriorated starting in 2018 or so, and up until the Biden administration launched a new initiative to draft together a new framework for cooperating. And they were successful in doing that. And they set up a new high-level security dialogue, which is at a ministerial level. They agreed to a new set of joint objectives that everybody agreed to in a 3-year action plan. So they've begun working on this. The real challenge is that you remember that fentanyl stuff. Well, here's the pattern of fentanyl being captured at the southwest border of the United States. It, as you can see, rose over 500%, the amount captured between 2019 and 2022, and in recent months it's continued to rise. So there's still a very big problem that a lot of this fentanyl is still coming through Mexico, some of it's being captured at our border, but other is still getting through. If our cooperation is working, I would put forward, we should see these numbers dropping of the amount of stuff that is seized. And if it's not dropping, more young Americans are likely to keep dying. Now, we're never going to stop it completely, but we've got to, I think, demonstrate progress in dealing with this. These are sort of, throughout this whole period of time, these have been the big challenges that have been very constant to try to build cooperation between the two governments. There is, with criminal groups, you can buy a lot of people, and you can combine your offer of money with your offer of, the option is to be shot, or your kid can be shot, or your kid can be kidnapped. And if you have a situation in your home area where your family can't be protected, is not being protected because there's a lot of disorder, not a lot of rule of law, that creates a real problem. And so that has been a problem with us. And as I mentioned, you've got to be able to build trust between law enforcement agencies if you're actually going to do successful investigations, arrests, and then trials and convictions between the two countries. And weak law enforcement justice systems still in Mexico. A lot of human rights violations still take place by the law enforcement community in Mexico. There is a serious problem of weapons trafficking from the United States into Mexico. It is believed that most of the weapons that are used by the criminal groups in Mexico are purchased legally in the United States and shipped south across the border. And we have not been able to agree on a system to try to stop those and intercept them in an effective way going southward, which is partially our fault as the United States and partially the fault of Mexicans. Also, we can talk about that. And then all this money from the drug flows, we have not been able to track it. Even with our best technology, the amount of money seized is really minute compared to the amount of money that we believe is being paid for the drugs. Okay, now back to a more positive side, trade, investment, and competitiveness. We'll give you, up your attitudes now. So there's a lot of trade going on. This is more trade than we have with all the European Union. It's over twice across North America than what we have with China. It is believed that up to 12 million U.S. jobs are supported by trade with Canada and Mexico. 50% of the trade across North America is in intermediate goods. That means they're goods that go into the final product made in one of the other three countries. That's the highest amount of any free, we use the word free trade, it's not really free trade, but any trade agreement in any region in the world. No other region has that. Even the European Union does not have that amount of intermediate good trade. And now, in the past couple of years, we've had a lot of nearshoring investment being encouraged after the pandemic for many reasons, coming back into all three countries. Reshoring is often if it comes back to the United States. But from the perspective of North America, it's all sort of nearshoring because it's coming to one of the three countries. And there's a lot of that going on. You can see here that trade across all of North America has grown over 4 times since since NAFTA was agreed in the early 1990s. It's pretty significant, and you can see that jump up in the last several years in trade across this area. One of the things that people didn't really understand, those of you who might remember NAFTA, and that NAFTA was never too popular in the United States, and Mr. Perot had some nice things to say about that. For those of you from Texas, you'll remember that. But this was a study done on the 20th anniversary of that agreement, which basically shows how much extra money each country made each year because we were trading across the three countries in a freer way. Not completely free, but in a freer way. And basically the United States was getting $127 billion extra in 2014. Mexico, $170 billion, and Canada, $70 billion. That came out to $400 per U.S. citizen because we had a cooperative agreement with our two neighbors. And if you look at Europe and China, that they're doing this. They have regional networks that they also use to make themselves more competitive and to be able to produce goods at a lower price. Anyway, then you can see the list. Take a minute, look. These are the top trading partners with Mexico and Canada. In the States, you can see there's a lot of similarity between the two lists. And again, that goes back to why. What do we make most of together? Cars, right. And we make those with parts from both countries, and we make them in the same states, right? So now there are other things in here too, but cars is sort of the constant between this. So there's a lot of states and a lot of jobs involved. And if NAFTA were to end, as you remember somebody once suggested, who was president of the United States, a lot of people would be unhappy because it would disrupt these markets. And it would not only disrupt these markets, the other thing here, which a lot of people don't realize, is that Canada and Mexico are our two largest ag export partners. So the whole center of the United States would suffer because farmers would suffer tremendously if their two largest export markets went back to normal tariffs rather than the tariff-free trade that we now have. So we negotiated this new agreement from NAFTA to USMCA, which entered into force in 2020. It had a number of improvements over NAFTA. It did not have everything everybody wanted, but it modernized the agreement. It changed the rules of origin, I can't just say that, right? It changed the rules by which we determine whether something gets to come in tariff-free. And it was done in a way with the idea that hopefully there would be more North American jobs created by changing this tariff structure. Now, we'll see if that's the case or not, but that was the intention of the changes that took place. Made a number of changes to how, when there's a disagreement, how you settle that. It expanded the agreement to take care of internet trade, to protect more of intellectual property rights, things that have been developed since NAFTA was negotiated in the early 1990s. It added labor and the environment to the core of the treaty. It also set up a clause that said, look, this is for 16 years. We're going to review it after 6 years and see how it's doing. And if somebody wants to get out, they can say, we want to get out then. We want to get out at the end of 16 years. Or we can extend it, or we can look at modifying it going forward. So this is being implemented right now. We're doing a pretty good job of implementing it, I think. The big the big area that the U.S. and Mexico talk about quite regularly is disputes over different facilities in Mexico where Mexicans cannot organize labor unions. And this was a big part of the new agreement, that you had a rapid dispute settlement mechanism for labor. So if the United States says this GM plant in Guanajuato is blocking any organizing by Mexican workers, we want an investigation of it, Mexico has to respond to that really quickly. And it's been working. They've solved 8 different cases so far of that. There are several big problems that haven't yet been solved, and that's one of the sort of acid tests for USMCA. When there's a really serious dispute, can it be solved? So right now, there are big disagreements over 3 issues. One involves the United States, where the United States has lost a complaint by Canada and Mexico saying they're using the wrong way to determine tariffs for cars, and the United States has not yet responded to that loss. The other is a case over energy, where the president of Mexico does not favor private investment in the energy sector and wants to strengthen the state-owned energy companies, and has initiated a number of regulatory steps to limit U.S. and Canadian energy investments. And we have complained about that, and that dispute is ongoing. The third big dispute is Mexico wants to introduce a regulation to prevent genetically modified corn from coming into Mexico. Well, genetically modified corn is what we all eat in the United States, and what our cows all eat in the United States, and what Mexicans' cows eat right now, because U.S. farmers sell most things to them. So if you don't solve this problem, you create a big trade dispute between the 2 countries. And Canada actually has joined this in too. Anyway, so those things need to be solved. The other thing we've done, and I won't go in detail here, is we've set up, one of the things that's become clear since the pandemic is having a trade agreement is not enough to really make your economy competitive with your partners. You need to do other stuff. The trade rules aren't enough to talk about supply chains, aren't enough to talk about, do you have a workforce that's actually educated well enough to deal with new technology and to be hired and to be effective? You have information technology systems. Do you have internets that actually interconnect and do things well? So we set up a separate group called the High-Level Economic Dialogue to try to look at those things. And the easy way to think about it is NAFTA plus stuff that will help you be more competitive in the world. And then we did the same thing with Canada in the framework of the North American Leaders Summit, which is something when the 3 leaders get together every year or 2 years. So they set up a number of working groups to try to make North America more competitive. And if you want to hear about these, I'll go into them in more detail, ask a question. But right now, I'll just point out they go through, what did I do? All right. I see. Now if I click it, there's the back. Anyway, I'll be happy to go through them and talk about them. It's a really impressive list of things, I will just say. And they are things we should do if we want the United States to be able to compete better in the world. We should do a bunch of these things with our 2 neighbors. So you can ask about them later. We can talk about them. All right, let's talk about politics in Mexico. So AMLO won 53% of the vote when he was elected. That gave him a large majority in the Congress. He beat by a big margin, the 2 competitors against him. He has remained amazingly popular. AMLO is a wonderful political communicator. He has morning press conferences 4 or 5 days a week, and he dominates the news. He talks for 2 hours on average every morning, talking about everything. He makes a lot of mistakes. He says a lot of false things, but he says them in a way that Mexicans think, oh, this is just like my neighbor Pedro down the street, or this is like Miguel talking to me, a friend. And so people really like him as a person. He has built up this rapport with Mexicans, which keeps him right now, at 57, 58% popularity in the country. That's really pretty amazing after all the years that have gone on. He's quite popular still. His party, which is called Morena, is also the most popular party, and if there were to be elections today, they would win a big chunk of the votes in the Congress. They're at over 40%, and you can see the opposition coalition is about 30%. And so if you win 40% in your district, you get the seat, right? And I mean, the opposition will get some proportional representation, but it's quite likely that Morena could come out with a big majority if elections were held today, and they are going to be held next year. On the other hand, if you ask Mexicans, are you really satisfied with the path that Mexico's on? More people say no than say yes. So there's a difference between who they like as a political party and how they honestly assess their own situation and the situation of their country. It's close, 35 to 33%, but there are more that say, no, we're not on a good path. So there's clearly a big division. People recognize that things in their daily life are not going well. I'm not going to go through all this, but AMLO promised something he called the fourth transformation. He promised a radical change in Mexico that would be equivalent to their revolution for independence, their civil war that threw out a dictator and put in a new regime. So a lot of it boiled down to reducing inequality in the economy, to restoring what he believed are the pillars of national wealth and power, control of the energy sector, reducing poverty in general, not just inequality, but helping the poorest to, in a number of different ways, to attacking corruption and inefficiency in the government. And he railed about corruption and inefficiency in the government of Mexico, of which there was corruption, but in reality, their civil service was actually pretty good compared to many other countries around the world. And finally, he had this theme about ending the war on drugs with hugs, not bullets, was his theme, and promised to emphasize human rights and set a number of goals, which you can look at the bottom here, none of which he's going to achieve. They have really not done very well on the security front. Not that it's easy to do, but they set very high goals and they really haven't worked. So indeed, after 3 years, he's still very popular. The USMCA is working well. The pandemic, which I really didn't mention, had a high number of deaths. Like many countries, Mexico did not deal with this well, and we can't say that we dealt with it perfectly. There are many countries around the world that didn't deal with it well. The economy shrunk over 8% during the pandemic. It's rebounded, but is just getting back to the pre-pandemic levels now. Poverty has not been reduced. It's back to the level that it was before the pandemic. But he promised to reduce poverty, and he hasn't yet done that. And then he has a number of very controversial infrastructure projects, which he is now struggling to implement. They're widely criticized from different angles, and he is resorting to more extreme methods to implement them, which has led the Supreme Court to say he's been doing a number of things that violate the Constitution in doing it. So this is going to be a very challenging set of issues up until the presidential elections next year in Mexico. Homicide, as we said, we already talked about a little bit. It has not... It's going down a little bit, but there's still historically high levels of crime. Corruption, no significant anti-corruption convictions. Rule of law, Mexico's gone down in the ratings for rule of law, and AMLO has been publicly attacking the Supreme Court, the National Electoral Authority. He has undermined other independent checks and balances in the Mexican system, which have alarmed a number of people in Mexico. He's given the military a whole wide swath. I was reading to a study by one group saying they've given them 70 different tasks that normally are done by civilians. And many people are concerned about giving the military not too many tasks to do in a democracy, and we can talk about that. Migrants, on the other hand, he has cooperated with the United States on managing migrants. They still, in Mexico, have very serious limits in the resources they devote to caring for migrants or are dealing with them, but they have been working to try to limit the presence of those migrants, and by absorbing some in the country and by sending others back to the country they've come from. This is just a little thing that a listing of how Mexico's treated in a number of different studies and indicators that look at human rights, governance, and democracy. 2022 was the deadliest year for journalists in Mexico. As you know, homicides and crime have increased since 2015 through 2021. Mexico's rated as the fourth worst country in the world for organized crime, according to a 2021 study. The World Justice Project, which does every year, looks at rule of law around the world, ranks Mexico at 115 out of 140 countries for rule of law. The Vance Center does a corruption assessment each year and finds that Mexico's has dropped down 3 places since 2020 compared to other Latin American countries, and ranks 9th of 17 countries that they rate in Latin America. The Economist Democracy Index, which looks at 167 countries, puts Mexico 89 out of 167. So you can see they're not doing too well in world rankings here. And we can do whatever we want to make that judgment. You could ask me about it. So I'm not going to go through I've already mentioned the economy. Just to mention the national energy companies, which he wanted to reassert their role. Pemex, which is the national oil company, has $107 billion worth of debt. It's the most indebted oil company in the world. It actually also has dropped in its oil production 3 years out of the last 4, so they're not doing too well. Its production in 2022 was the worst since 1979. So the whole goal of putting this back into under the state has not yet proven its results. And then we can talk about the National Electricity Authority also has been losing money, which is the other institution he's been trying to strengthen. So let's look at migration again for a minute. So what this shows you, these are the number of encounters at the southwest border of the United States of migrants coming across irregularly. So as you probably know, 2022 was a record number. It is a big jump, as we mentioned, especially from Venezuela, Nicaragua, Haiti, and Cuba. The United States and Mexico agreed to a plan that Mexico would accept back migrants from the United States from those countries, and in exchange, the United States set up a program to allow 30,000 migrants per month to come in from those countries if they applied from their home country or from another country other than Mexico, if they applied from afar. That actually seems to have been fairly successful. So here, the Biden administration approaches to migration. We can talk about this. 1, address the root causes, which is development assistance and other things. This is a sound approach, but it's going to take 5, 10, 15 years to actually have a difference. Seek closer cooperation with Mexico in managing that. That seems to be bearing some fruit. Building broader regional cooperation to help care for people further away from the United States. This reflects that there's a large number of people coming from South America. You may have read articles about the Darien Gap, which is the jungle between Panama and Colombia, and a lot of people coming through there. Many, many thousands. And so the idea is that we should work together as a region to actually care for these people before they get up to the United States, and provide better care for them and go after the migrant smugglers that are working. The other approach of the Biden administration is to expand legal pathways for people to come so they can apply from afar and come. And so the Biden administration has suggested we expand worker visas for people to come on a temporary basis with the idea they'll go back home after they've come and work. And so they've expanded those numbers, and the idea is they'd like to do that more, especially since the United States has a shortage of many workers in many different sectors. And then to improve our own management of refugees and asylum seekers and others when they get to the United States. The other key thing that the Biden administration keeps asking is, Congress, can you guys please get together on immigration reform? We haven't had a serious immigration reform since the 1980s in the United States. That is needed. We can talk about that. So what they did in the last several weeks, the Biden administration, is they deployed more people to the border, both enforcement people and people to make judgments on cases that come in, and more people to care for migrants if they come in large numbers. And they've built more beds, more facilities, other things. They haven't had to use those yet because, as you noticed, everybody was expecting a big surge, and there was none. The surge was actually a few days before we eliminated the COVID expulsions. They put a new phone app in so people can apply to come for an interview via the phone app. And as you know, there have been problems with the phone app, but apparently it's working enough. There are at least 1,000 appointments a day that people get. They also, I think, very importantly, told people that if we catch you and you haven't applied in the proper way and we send you back, you're going to be excluded for 5 years from the United States for sure, no matter what, even if you have a very valid claim. And I think that was a powerful message to people. They didn't want to get caught and have 5 years that they couldn't apply again. I already mentioned the next two. The other thing the United States is going to do, they finally said they should do this faster, is set up centers in other countries in Latin America where people can go and make their claims from those places. Colombia and Guatemala are the first two they're going to set up. So this is a signal as to why we need reform in the United States. These are the number of people waiting for an interview on their asylum claims in the United States. Look at that. Isn't that a shame? So we got over 2 million people in the United States waiting for a judge to listen to them. Why haven't we employed more judges? Why haven't we built more courtrooms? And this is clear. This started, 2010 going on. Part of it is that we can't get consensus among our parties on the appropriate approach here. I think we really need that. All right, so we got all these mechanisms set up to solve problems. Can we solve them? Big areas: trade, border migration, drugs, trafficking. How can we rebuild confidence? I'm getting to where we're going to talk about, but I'm going to have one more thing here. Democratic backsliding in Mexico. Okay, this is going to be a really dangerous year for both countries. Both countries have serious polarization. Both countries have a number of people with extreme views who are going to be speaking out over this period of time. One of them happens to be the president of Mexico. The other of them happen to be either candidates or elected representatives in the United States. And so we're going to have to manage this. In Mexico, AMLO regularly attacks his critics. He is pushing really hard to get his agenda completed before he leaves office. That means he is testing the Constitution. He gets very angry when the court says you violated the Constitution. And a number of these cases, what the court has said is just reading the Constitution. He is violating the Constitution with what he's done. But he doesn't like that because he's pushing to get stuff done. So what do you do in this kind of a situation? What do you do with a neighbor country when you think they're having a problem with their democratic system? Just do it the other way around. If you're Canada and you're worried about the United States, do you say something to the United States? What do you do about this? You know, it's hard, right? Neighboring country you trade a lot with, you work on, you do things. They have their own internal system. What do you do? Other part of it is AMLO is becoming regularly critical of the United States in his morning press briefings. If any other leader of a friendly country said some of the things he's been saying about the United States, it would be a big scandal. And then on the other hand, as you know, a number of members of Congress, all from the Republican Party, have also said a number of things that are very critical of Mexico and offering solutions that probably wouldn't be successful solutions, but it reflects their frustration with what's going on. So big question, how do we manage these things over the next year and a half so we don't damage a tremendously important relationship that we have with this country? So with that, why don't I take your questions?
We'll sit over here for
And
a
I'll
few
have
minutes.
some water, since I've talked a lot.
Yes. Yeah, we're happy to take questions or comments. We got another 20 minutes or so before we close, just about on time. Anybody? Yes.
You mentioned that 5 states in Mexico were the focus of the corruption there. Just do these states correlate with tourism or drug trade or population or?
No, they're the most violent states. They're where most homicides take place, and they coordinate with competition between drug cartels and organized criminal gangs. A lot of people are being killed with gangs fighting for control of transit routes to be able to sell their drugs to the United States.
So it doesn't correlate with border states?
No.
Okay.
No, but some of them are. One of them is a border state.
Yeah, some of them, for example, the state of Quintana Roo, Cancun, which is a big tourism place, is quite a violent place. And you see this dynamic.
Tamaulipas, which
Yeah.
is just down south.
Right.
Texas is a very violent state. It's also a major state
Right.
for both migrants and drugs being smuggled across the border. So what correlates is either criminal activity or 2 or more criminal groups competing to control certain parts of that state.
Right. Yes.
Ambassador, thank you for being here. Regarding the energy trade dispute, as 2024 approaches, what do you think will happen and how will both countries react to it?
Well, I'm really not sure what will happen. So far, the United States and Canada formally filed a complaint. They're having discussions with the government of Mexico, but they have not called for a dispute panel. What that means is that it would go to a panel of experts who would hear the arguments and then make a decision. The Canadians have recently said we're still negotiating with the Mexicans and we're making progress. My impression is that neither Canada or the United States want to push it to a dispute settlement panel at this time. And it could be, but I'm just speculating, that they want to wait until after the Mexican presidential elections and then see who might be in power in Mexico at that time. It might
Yes.
be more open to a negotiated solution. But this is just me speculating. Nobody's said anything.
Yes, thank you for your talk. It looks like the Morena Party has just a complete lock on the elections. I was wondering if there's anything that the opposition parties are doing that might form a coalition or something that might change this. I mean, if not, it doesn't look very good for anyone but whoever the Morena candidate is.
Right. I mean, I think the key for the opposition is, can they come up with a dynamic candidate that during the campaign will rally a lot of discontent? As you can see, there are a lot of people that aren't happy with the direction Mexico's going. There are a number of people who are not happy with the current government's policies in key sectors, including public security. So if you had a candidate who could effectively enunciate those things, that might make a difference. Right now, there's no candidate that's emerged on the opposition side, and so there's been no rallying yet to any candidate who might be contrasted with AMLO's chosen successor, which of the, he has two right now that he might pick. One or might be, might come forward, might be picked, let's say. And so I think that's what we're going to have to wait and see. If it's just parties versus parties, I think it's right. The opposition is not looking too strong. There's going to be, there's going to be an election this Sunday in the state of Mexico, which is a state that surrounds about 2/3 of Mexico City. It's a very populous state. It has long been controlled by the PRI, the PRI party, which is the longtime party that dominated Mexican politics. But it looks like the Morena party candidate is going to win if the polls are correct. So that would, again, that would reinforce your conclusion that unless something big changes people's perspectives, the Morena party and the Morena candidate has a very good chance of winning next year.
Yeah, over here. Yeah.
Well, I think you answered my question. My question was, who do you think might be some of the top contenders for the presidency?
Well, the two candidates for the that are thought to be the leaders on the Morena side are the Ms. Sheinbaum, who's the mayor of Mexico City, and Mr. Ebrard, who's the foreign minister. And Sheinbaum seems to have done an okay job as mayor of Mexico City. She's a trained scientist before she became a politician. Marcel Ebrard was also the mayor of Mexico City previously. He's currently the foreign minister. He's done a lot of international things, but Sheinbaum rates more highly in the polls right now. But who knows yet who might emerge? It would probably be one of those two for the Morena side. And then on the opposition side, there are a whole bunch of potential candidates. They haven't figured out how they're going to select a candidate yet among the three different parties. And I'm sure that will take a lot of pulling and tugging amongst them. One of the challenges is it's hard to have a coalition of parties that aren't formally linked together be very effective in political communications. And that's showing up in how popular or unpopular they are in the polls.
Yes.
Ambassador, thanks for that comprehensive overview. My question is specific to the MCA, and you mentioned the improvements towards the environmental policy. With the energy policy specifically, moving away, finally the U.S. seems to be moving and recognizing the energy transition, decarbonization. Is there a mechanism in that agreement to deal with that transition, and then to deal obviously with an important neighbor with air quality and these sort of practical issues in that?
No. As you remember, this agreement was negotiated under the Trump administration, and the Trump administration did not have climate change as a priority, and they didn't put it into the agreement. And AMLO, when he got elected, demanded that all the substance of the energy chapter be taken out, except it basically says the energy wealth of Mexico is the property of the state of Mexico. Now, what he didn't know and what is still in the agreement are a bunch of commitments of how you treat investors and how you deal with regulations and other things, and those are the grounds on which the United States has complained, because a number of, it would appear that a number of the steps taken by the government of Mexico have violated those parts of USMCA, but we won't know for sure until an expert panel says yes, they have. But private energy companies affected by this also could bring suit directly against, under USMCA and under the provisions of the negotiation, directly with the government of Mexico should they choose to do so. So what the Mexican government has tried to do, and appears they're trying to do, is to negotiate individual solutions to the problem of individual companies to see if they can resolve enough of the differences so that it doesn't become a massive issue. But no, unfortunately, the environment is not written into the USMCA in the climate change part of the environment. Exists a number of the international agreements on protection of wildlife and conservancy and other things are in there, but not the climate change agreement. So what the United States has been trying to do, and John Kerry in particular, is to explain to AMLO with a whole series of visits that green energy, that solar energy, renewable energy is a big plus for Mexico, and they could meet a number of their energy needs, but also meet their climate commitments under the Paris Accord by encouraging this kind of investment. He seems to have made some progress in getting AMLO to recognize the importance of that, and there's at least one governor from the Morena Party, Mr. Durazo in Sonora, who is in fact sponsoring a gigantic solar energy effort, which AMLO has supported. So Kerry has been doing a lot of efforts to persuade AMLO that this is a good thing for Mexico, but it's not in the treaty per se.
Back there? Yep. Way up there.
What are the efforts of the countries in trying to control the precursor chemicals that are going into the synthetic opioids?
Not very much right now. I think there's a big space for doing more with, more forcefully with China and India to try to find ways to convince them to control the flow of chemical precursors from their chemical companies. The Chinese cut off any dialogue with us about chemical precursors 2 years ago, I think, after we started putting more tariffs on their goods and things. And they have denied that there's any problem of fentanyl or illegal precursors being shipped from their country, which is not true, but that's sort of the state of play. And so one of the big challenges is, can you mount a more effective international coalition effort to either sanction or in some other way create pressure on companies that are still shipping these precursor chemicals? Is there a more effective way to do it? Right now, there's not a very effective way. And that's a very serious problem.
Here. Mm-hmm.
Is the currency in Mexico relative to the U.S. getting stronger? And if so, why is that happening?
Their central bank is paying 6% interest, I think, for any deposit, for capital flowing in. So the interest rate return in Mexico is very high right now because they're trying to control inflation. So a lot of money is flowing into Mexico. Does that make sense at all? There's a lot of money to be made if you ship your money to Mexico. That has raised the value of the peso because so much foreign currency is flowing in. 11%. Is it 11%? Thank you. Thanks for helping me. Yes, I remembered it was high. I didn't remember how much. So a lot of money is flowing in there. You know, and if you have a couple $100 million or $1 million available, you send it in, you can make 11%. That's a lot better than putting it here where you can make 5%. So the impact of that is the peso has gone up in value relative to the dollar.
Okay, we got 5 more minutes. 2 questions right here. Yeah, you too. Yeah.
Consider all this polarization that we are having, and I mean, considering also that the trade agreement, I mean, the U.S. MCA, it's blocking many of the policies and of AMLO, let's say energy and oil. I think that kind of agreement is not really good to, I mean, for him. Considering that, and also considering that Shellman is going, I mean, because his popularity, he's going to be elected in 2024. Do you think the sunset clause in the agreement is going to be executed by AMLO? I mean, that means to end the trade agreement.
Well, he would be shooting himself in the foot if he did that. I don't know. I don't think he will, because I think all their growth, very little of the growth in Mexico over the past 3 years has come from domestic growth in Mexico. It has come from selling goods to the United States and getting remittances from Mexico in the United States. Would you want to throw away, to raise your own tariffs on your own goods? I don't think so. Whatever he may think about, he may not like the limits on this, but he's getting so much from it, I don't think he will, he would call for the end of it. No,
Right
I
here.
don't think so.
Yes, sir.
In Mexico, there's a lot of talk about the result of the U.S.-China tensions, that the natural place to invest is Mexico, so all the nurturing will go to Mexico. But at the same time, there's a lot of worries because of the uncertainty for investors. What do you think? Is there a real chance of a big flow of nearshoring going to Mexico? Do you see a strategy for that?
Yeah, there is a big chance for a lot of nearshoring going to Mexico. And there is nearshoring going on. If you look at the FDI, foreign direct investment figures for this year, you know, it's going up. But my view is it could go up a lot more if there was actually a policy to attract and incentivize that investment. And so where you've seen a governor doing that, like in Nuevo León, you see some very big investments going on there. But the federal government does not have a set of policies to attract investment. In fact, as part of their austerity move, they eliminated the investment agency, investment attraction agency, as you probably know, that existed before. However efficient or inefficient it was, at least it worked at trying to attract investment. And it's not evident to me that there's any incentive program, as many states in the United States have, you know, to give tax benefits or other kind of benefits if you invest in an area. There's not a national level. There are at certain states they're doing that. So I think Mexico could be attracting a lot more investment. And then, as you said, there's uncertainty. Certain states, there's public insecurity. Other states, there's poor roads. Other places, there's concern, am I going to be able to get enough energy if I build this big plant that's going to use a lot of energy? Will it be available? Is there going to be enough production or not? People are worried about that. And then other states, there's a worry, is there going to be enough water for the processes that I have to take place? And that's especially in the northern states, as you know. And the government of Mexico has actually talked about that also, and they would like to see investment in the southern states. The problem with investment in the southern states is, do you have a trained workforce? Do you have roads that are going to work? do you have electricity that's going to be there or not? And those questions are not at all clear. So we could be seeing, the government of Mexico seems to be trying to develop a number of policies to attract investment to its new Trans-Isthmus project in the south of the country. And there we might see some incentives. But we'll have to look at those, and private sector companies will have to judge how attractive they really are. But there was a high-level dialogue between the United States and Mexico maybe 4 or 5 months ago. And Secretary Blinken and Secretary Raimondo, Secretary of State and Secretary of Commerce, went down to this. And they basically told the Mexican leaders, okay, we've passed this legislation and we have a lot of money now. We're going to invest in these areas to make things more competitive. You all can take advantage of that, but you got to put your own funds in to also help incentivize and spur investment. That was sort of their message. And I haven't seen anything since then that the Mexican government has actually done that.
Right. Last question back there. Yes, up there. Mm-hmm.
Ambassador, you mentioned the lackluster performance of Pemex. Has AMLO had much impact in terms of changing the management, restructuring how Pemex operates, and dealing with the labor unions, which have tremendous power within the Pemex empire?
Well, he's had a free hand he's had an energy minister who was fully committed to his plan. He's had a head of Pemex who's been fully, as somebody he put in there. What they have been able to yield or to is, all I can do is judge by their production figures and other things, which are not very great. And so, there's not evidence of a turnaround in the offing, in the figures that they put out every few months. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sure Ambassador Wayne will, stay with us for a few more minutes if you want to talk to him individually, but we've run out of time for the formal component of the event. But he'll probably hang out for a few more minutes. So thank you very much, Ambassador, for your visit to the Baker Institute.
Thank you.
Thank you.